Good morning to everybody. I hope that you had a good night's sleep. For those of you that went on the wine safari, I hope it was lovely. And welcome to the final day of the conference. Now, Professor Roux is he has been the MC all along, but it would be weird if he announces himself. No. So that's why you're seeing me here today. But I am under strict orders to say no more than 5 things.
5 seconds.
Okay, 5 seconds. Okay, you're starting to count already. Right. So I picked the 5 things that I like the best about Professor Roux. So in the late 90s, he designed and imagined and got registered our MPhil in Future Studies, making it one of the oldest academic programs in future studies, literally in the world. So that's the one thing. And then for more than 20 years, he was the director of the IFR, the Institute for Futures Research. So he did a lot of practical work in future studies while managing and doing everything on the academic program as well. So more than 2 decades of academic and those practical experience. And he still continues doing that. He didn't stop. So he's still the head of our academic programs. And last year, he was also the head of teaching and learning for the whole of the school. And he got numerous awards for best lecturer. You will see just why just now. If you haven't noticed it already, I mean, that would just mean you're a little bit slow, but you will see it just now then. All right. And he also sits on the program accreditation committee of the WFSF. Where he then parts with his knowledge and help, like what Luke and them explained yesterday, help other schools during the accreditation process. And then, I mean, like all good academics, he has a lot of publications. I mean, like pages and pages and pages and pages of it. But the one I like the best is his book on the South African economy. Because, I mean, notoriously, economics are difficult, and economists prefer that dazed look in your eyes most of the time. Now, after 2 seconds, they start speaking in tongues because they want your eyes to just do that, and then you don't understand. Not him. He actually explains economics in such a manner that normal people of the earth actually understand. And that book is already, I'm so afraid to get it wrong, in its 14th edition. Are we working on 15? Probably. All right. It was first published in the 90s. It's probably one of the most prescribed textbooks on just understanding the economy. So those were my 5 things. Over to the professor.
Thank you very much, Doris, for those kind words. It was actually 6 things, but it doesn't matter. The idea was to talk to you about scenarios in South Africa. Over the last couple of days, numerous people have asked me to say a bit about this place, this institute, future studies at the university. So I've changed the angle of attack slightly. As you can see there, I've called reflections on future thinking, future studies at this university, and indeed in South Africa. Some of you might have seen a similar version of this a few weeks ago, a few months ago. I can't remember that colloquium, but pretend that it's brand new to you and you haven't seen it before. I'm going to talk about, in what is now only 22 minutes, in the beginning, the genesis of our future studies programs and adventures in the country, our approach of philosophy, and then a brief reference to the role that scenarios have played and still do play, before concluding with the increasingly important continuum between the academic side of things and, as Doris pointed out, having a bunch of clients for whom we do all kinds of work. So in the beginning, we're talking about the early 1970s. By the way, we were established in 1974, which meant that last year we celebrated our 50th birthday. So, but before that, in the lead up to that, just remind you, first of all, at a global level, The world population then was let's make it 4 billion. That's now obviously more than double that. In those days, I always find this fascinating, the population of Africa was barely half, in fact, less than half of that of Europe. Today, of course, totally different. 1.2 billion in Africa and 700 million in Western Europe. In those days, China was a word we probably saw on a map, but other than that, we weren't all that interested, accounting for only about 5% of the world economy, and today, as we all know, close to 20%. On the right-hand side, you see a bigger picture of how back in the 1980s even, and even into the 1990s, how the developed world accounted for 60% and the rest of the world 40% of the world economy. It's now swapped around. In those days, 1970s, 1973, many of you know this, we had two oil price crises. The first crisis was when the oil price doubled to reach the unbelievable heights of $4. And by the way, as you probably know, this also kind of saw the recognition of Royal Dutch Shell and their work and scenarios. In those days, the Cold War was alive and well. The Berlin Wall stood firm. Some of you might remember this gentleman, Richard Nixon, was forced out of office. And the fourth IR, we weren't even really talking about the third IR in those days. We just entered the first possible fringes, something called the third IR. There was a remarkable progression. The IBM 5100 sold between $9,000 and $20,000, or between $51 and $113 today's terms, and at the time advertised can store more information than any other commercial machine, a full 48,000 bits. AI, 1974. There were concerns about AI. Not a new idea. And then, of course, we had the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth, the first the first warning, if you like, probably, that became well known are sustainability issues. We could argue that what we saw emerging was three major issues. A huge question mark in the wake of the First, Second World War, the Great Depression, huge question mark behind the efficiency and effectiveness of capitalism, the growing awareness of the importance of emerging interdependencies, and then we saw social systems thinking, social sciences, and futures thinking started emerging, started evolving, aided and abetted by the development of information technology. There was kind of a grand convergence, a perfect storm, the growing awareness of the dangers of isolationism, growing environmental threats, and then the rapid progress in transport, communication, and the like. It's argued, and many of you know this, that this kind of laid the foundation for the establishment of futures thinking, futures research, and the like. I won't bore you with this awful detail, but I do want to show you this on the next slide. At the earliest academic centers for futures thinking include the Vatican's Gregorian University, Turku, Corvinus University in Budapest, the Y Research Center, and I'm happy to say, in yellow, the Unit for Futures Research here, and of course, University of Houston, Clear Lake. So that's at the international level. Bad enough, the world condition. Here at home in South Africa, and sometimes difficult even for us to really imagine how bad things were, never mind for people who've never been here before. But have a look, just a brief look at what the world was like, what South Africa was like. We had discrimination, I'm sure you all know that. In those days, and for many years before that, and for years after that, the economic situation, political situation dominated by a minority group, the white population. Absolute and deliberate discrimination and apartheid. Because of that international isolation, we became increasingly isolated. What growth there was was very exclusive, only really to the benefit of the privileged white people. Poverty was rife, inequality huge, and incomes generally falling for all population groups. And again, just a few pictures to really drive home how awful things were. There you can see, sadly, the result of explosions, internal explosions. We had widespread discrimination, and most of our beaches, for instance, were not people who were not white were not allowed to go anywhere near our beaches, our beautiful beaches. We had this international call for isolation. Economic growth from round about the late 70s up until the early 90s was dismal and often negative. The next one I sometimes hesitate to show. It's so awful. It's not a picture, but it does still, the results of what I'm going to show you now still linger and have a major bearing on all kinds of issues in the country. And that is education policies, the very warped education policies. For many decades, these harsh words kind of reflected the then official view of education for Black African children. That gentleman, whose name you see there, later became Prime Minister. At the time, he was Minister of Education, where he says, there's no place for the Bantu, a word used from time to time to describe Black African people. There's no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use, he asks, of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? That's quite absurd. Education must train people in accordance with their opportunities in life, according to the sphere in which they live. And then in a similar vein, Blacks should never be shown the greener pastures of education. They should know their situation, their station in life is to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, taking some kind of biblical justification for their then policy. In 1976, we had a major event in South Africa. In Soweto, which is a huge, so-called township, it's more than a township these days, it is a growing city. By the way, Soweto stands for Southwestern Township, to the southwest of Johannesburg. The then Minister of Education, I forget his name, announced that from now onwards, all education, or at least 50% of all education must be conducted in Afrikaans. Now, most Black people didn't speak Afrikaans, didn't have to. And then suddenly they were told, you're going to get at least half your lessons in Afrikaans. And that was the final straw that broke the camel's back. We saw people objecting. The police, I'm afraid, came out in full force. People were killed. There you see Hector Peterson, 12-year-old child, was killed in this. And that was probably, as I say, the final straw that broke the camel's back. From there onwards, we saw growing isolation of the country. Boycotts, sanctions, call it what you like. Meanwhile, we have a look at television in 1974 in this country. Well, that's it. We think back, and I suppose in many cases, we were blissfully unaware very often what was happening globally and locally. We had newspapers, but they were probably rather biased. We didn't really know, to be perfectly honest, about these harsh realities. So, we now into the early 1970s. The Club of Rome had given note, as it were, that planet Earth was unhappy, that the frenetic, obsessive pursuit of growth was just not sustainable. Here at home, this period of isolation, stagnation, fatalism, and leaders, a growing number of business leaders and some political leaders, desperately needed foresight, strategic foresight. And so we saw, the story is told by my predecessor, Philip Spies, that sometime in the early 70s, a group of concerned South African business people approached the university and said, look, we are becoming aware of these global issues and our own issues. It's just not sustainable. Wouldn't you, University of Stellenbosch, consider establishing some kind of research unit to look at something that's let's call it future studies. The university said, yes, that's a good idea, but we're not willing to throw money at this. So you are welcome. We will allow the establishment of such a unit, but it has to be self-financing. So we saw the establishment initially of something called the Unit of Futures Research, as I was saying a bit earlier, 51 years ago. From the very outset, it had to be self-financing, which meant it had to rely very heavily on a client base and then commissioned research. And to this day, that forms the foundation of the financing model of the now institute. So it's had, since the beginning, a relationship with the university, initially based in Stellenbosch as a subunit of the Bureau of Economic Research, but later moving away from that, not because of any feelings of animosity, but simply because the Bureau of Economic Research was more concerned with cyclical analyses and obviously future studies more long-term. So somewhere in the mid-80s, we moved our offices to this campus, where we still are, obviously. So very strong and growingly strong relationship with the business school, which I'll touch on a bit later as well. I mentioned we have a client base. We provide various services and products. And perhaps just to reiterate that, we use future studies for, to a large extent, strategic decision-making. You know these words, I'm preaching to the converted. Environmental scanning, multiple perspectives. We don't predict the future, obviously. We exchange for a range of products. And then we also like to think that we are continuously establishing and building upon the futures thinking practice and philosophy as an intellectual model, amongst other things. So even when we get engaged in so-called interventions for organizations, willingly or knowingly or unknowingly, it's all built upon the bedrock of proper, rigorous and vigorous principles. And I'd like to think that as a result, and there's still lots of work needs to be done, but the future is no longer seen by everybody as some kind of mystical, ephemeral, temporal dimension. It's being seen as a space and time that can be measured and can be created by using the right kinds of techniques, tools, and the like. And the work is still going on, obviously, evangelical work. I think we've made a great deal of progress in the last 51 years, both at a corporate level, government level, but also via our academic programs. So scenarios in this country have been conducted regularly, probably since the early 1970s, and still are. Many of them are more at an institutional level. Interventions, and we involved, Doris and them, and sometimes they invite me to get involved. Numerous exercises, one a week, one every 2 weeks probably, some bigger ones, some smaller ones. So that continues. Meanwhile, at a national level, in the public domain, scenarios have and continue to play a potentially very important role. So I take you back to now the late 80s, the early 1990s. We started becoming aware of that things are going to change. Nelson Mandela was released from prison, the African National Congress was unbanned, and now we're going to start negotiating for a transition. But you can imagine that this created a huge vacuum of uncertainty. What's going to happen? For better or for worse, we don't know. So there was a wide spectrum of emotions, nervousness, skepticism, fear, excitement, joy, relief, ignorance. And in that period that ensued, from the late 80s to early 90s, at least 3 major scenario exercises were conducted by different entities. And many would agree, as would I, that these went a long way towards calming the emotions of business people, ordinary citizens, and politicians. They served as an advocacy and consensus building function, I'll summarize, they kind of sketch scenarios of what the country would look like without any transition, not a very happy situation, as opposed to scenarios that could materialize as a result of transition, some of which were extremely positive. The three there are the Anglo-American scenarios. Clem Sunter took the lead there. Then Nedco and Old Mutual. Just a slight footnote there. At the time, I was working at Old Mutual as an economist, a rather junior economist, and I had to do some of the behind the scenes, a bit of the research. And the story is told that when they had their first ever meeting of a scenario team, one of the members of the team from Old Mutual asked the chair of Old Mutual, why are we doing this? And the answer was, well, presumably because we want to figure out the future of the financial sector, financial services in this, what became known as the new South Africa. And the person asking the question said, oh, are we sure that's why we're doing this? And the story is told that the chairman then said to himself, well, maybe we need to test this. So he, at the very first meeting, he asked everyone there to write down why they think we are here. And the majority wrote down, we're concerned about the future for our children. And that changed the entire texture and objective of the exercise. Then we had the Montfleur scenarios. Now, Adam, are you here today? Is Adam here? Adam Gordon? He was here yesterday. Sorry? He actually facilitated the Montfleur scenarios. And that saw a meeting for the first time of people who would later become influential. People in our politics and our former, two former finance ministers were there. One of them was also at one stage governor of the Reserve Bank. And it is told that they entered these scenario exercises with a certain ideological bias and then left the exercise with a slightly altered ideological bias. I'm not saying that they became raving capitalists, not at all. They started realizing the importance of having a well-functioning financial economic system. So each of these had their own objectives, their own methodologies, their own budgets, their own ideological bent, but each one in its own way, I say again, probably addressed the interests of different kinds of stakeholders in such a way that it enhanced the understanding of the possible outcomes of fundamental policy, ideological changes in the country, given the fact we're about to become a fledgling democracy. Now, a few years ago, a certain gentleman, Nick Siegel, was asked to actually write a monologue or have a look at the influence of these scenarios. And amongst other things, and again, I'm probably preaching the converted, he gave us a number of important lessons. You know these things, I'll just highlight one or two. Bearing in mind, every scenario exercise is unique. Has its own purpose, own cast of characters. Now in South Africa, you can imagine the cast of characters is extremely diverse. So it's important, as we always say, to understand where everyone's coming from. Understand each one's elephants in the room, their own way of thinking, their own moral standards and the like. And then something else discovered towards the bottom, the quality of the facilitator and the participants is crucial. You need the right team, as it were. Always bear in mind who the audience is. You want legitimacy. That's a difficult one. That's a tricky one in this country. You need to be able to involve as many stakeholders as possible, because they're not involved, they get rather uppity and might even reject the exercise as a matter of principle. But at the same time, you don't want too many people. It goes on to say, look at the bottom one, again, the facilitator must be independent, neutral, must have a sense of fun. It doesn't need to be a subject expert. And then size and composition of the team, ideally not more than 20. what methodology, or whatever the facilitator prefers to reach and to achieve desired outcomes. Right, so let me start ending off by moving on in the chapter, and that Doris alluded to in 1997. At the time I was director of the IFR, I felt surely now, after close to 25 years of doing this, not me personally, but the Institute, it's time to also offer an academic, if you like, angle to what we are doing by introducing a program. And I was told by all and sundry, forget it. It will never happen. The people who have to approve this won't know what you're talking about, and it will take years and years and years. So I rather ambitiously said, well, I'm going to give it a go. Those in this country know the bureaucratic nightmare is unbearable, putting all kinds of forms where every single full stop and comma is scrutinized. So I managed to put in the forms that went through to various committees, moving upwards. But the big challenge is the so-called University's Academic Planning Committee, chaired by the Vice Rector of Teaching and Learning. And it got that far, and I was summoned to this meeting to justify and testify almost. And I was told there's going to be a nightmare. Now, let me also add, in those days, we had to complete these forms in two languages, English and Afrikaans. Afrikaans is not my mother tongue, so here and there I might struggle. But in any case, so I was summoned, and there he was, this chair of the committee, gazing at me and taking a deep sigh and pursing his lips. I thought, okay, here we go. And he showed that one of the words I used was not correctly spelled. There was an S missing. I said, okay, sorry. Made a note. He said, okay, any other questions, committee? I said, no. He said, okay, let's through it. From there, went to the Council of Higher Education, which normally again takes a year or more. Is Marianne here today? She used to work there. Normally takes, if you're lucky, a year. So you normally plan, if you do manage to get this far, maybe in 2 or 3 years' time, you'll start the program. After 3 months, it was around about September of the year, I got the message from the CHE, go for it, full steam ahead, with green light. So it gave us 3 months, because our academic year starts in January. It gave us 3 months to get the right lectures, to market the program, material, you name it. But we managed that. And so we found that our first student intake was in 1998. Our first graduates, end of the next year. In the meantime, the university embarked upon distance education, which is a bit of a misnomer. It was actually education by live TV in those days. But it was live. It wasn't watching your own child. It actually worked quite well, remarkably well. We were able to interact with everybody across the country, across the world for that matter. Then sometime in about 15 years ago, 12 years ago, we were told that from now onwards, before you can do an MPhil, which we call our program, you first need a postgraduate qualification in that same discipline. Now, in this country, we have two options. We have something called an honors degree after your first degree, or a postgraduate diploma. We aim for the latter. So now we actually have two programs, PG Dip and Future Studies. We had to revise, obviously, the MPhil, which was a good exercise. COVID-19 hit us all. We were able to transition from normal lecturing to online lecturing within, I would say, a weekend. We had been prepared for it, incidentally. By luck or by judgment, I don't know. We revamped the PG Dip in 2022. And then the latest development is in 23, we introduced an additional stream in the PG Dip. So it's a PG Dip, Future Studies, Management of New Technologies. We actually have two kinds of PG Dips and then the Masters, as well as a growing number of PhD students. So I'm very proud to say that over the last 2 years, I have supervised successfully 3 PhDs, one of whom is sitting to my left here in front, Doris. And then just last week, a third one passed his oral exam. He'll be graduating in December. And there are more. We've actually had for next year eight applications, which is going to be difficult, but that's it. That's not your problem. I need to start ending off. I did start a little bit late, so I will allow myself trying to end off by simply doing this. I think that's the right one I want to go at. No, not that one. Yes, I will look at this one. A little bit tongue in the cheek. And I suppose indirectly kind of relevant to what we're trying to do to, I would almost say, professionalize future studies. One of my favorite words is an ultra-crepidarian. One who is presumptuous and offers advice or opinions beyond your own sphere of knowledge. And then for those who didn't start off life as futurists, you might be an opsimath. You begin to learn or study only later in life. But I think, I know it's tongue in the cheek, but I think ultra-crepidarianism is a problem in our profession. Many people who claim, rightly or wrongly, to be qualified futurists and engage in teaching it, maybe their claims are a bit exaggerated. To conclude, what I think is most important is that the IFR and the academic offerings are moving closer and closer together. In fact, I would tempted to say that before very long, an outsider will not be able to even discern any difference, and rightly so. It's becoming one unified kind of thing. So the IFR as kind of a school, not a school, as a center for research and let's call it consultation, but blending wonderfully with academic programs. So I can say with all sincerity that Doris is the head of the IFR, but she's a very important teacher on our programs, which I think is wonderful, and vice versa. I'm nominally heading up the programs, still involved in the IFR. So I think it's this constant back and forth, and each one reinforcing the other. So we learn a great deal, obviously, from doing our so-called consultations or research, which we plow back into the academic side. The academic side is, as I said earlier, implicitly included in the way we conduct our research. We feel very strongly about rigorous and vigorous principles. And this unification does already, and will, I'm sure in the future, serve the business school, the faculty under which we operate, the university, and then going beyond just university. Society at large, local, international, rest of Africa, anywhere in the world.